The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the reception hall was how perfect everything looked. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables dressed in ivory linen. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell in waves. A string quartet played something soft and romantic, the kind of music meant to make people believe in happy endings. From the outside, my brother's wedding looked like a celebration pulled straight out of a magazine. From the inside, it felt like walking into a carefully staged ambush. I arrived already tense, shoulders tight, smile rehearsed. My family has never been good at gathering without turning it into an evaluation. Weddings, holidays, funerals, it never mattered. There was always judgment disguised as concern, curiosity sharpened into quiet cruelty. I told myself I was here for my brother, that I could survive a few hours. Still, my pulse thudded too fast as I scanned the room, aware that every pair of familiar eyes would soon land on me, measuring how I looked, what I wore, who I came with, or didn't. The venue was extravagant, almost aggressively so. Gold accents, towering floral arrangements, champagne flowing like it would never run out. It should have felt joyful. Instead, the weight in my chest grew heavier with every step, as if the beauty of the place was mocking how little I wanted to be there. Then I saw them. My cousin stood near the center of the room, laughing easily, one manicured hand resting on the arm of the man beside her. My ex-fiancé. He looked confident, relaxed, exactly the way he used to look when he thought he was admired. People leaned in when they spoke to them, smiling, nodding, clearly impressed. Together, they looked like a success story my family could proudly display. For a moment, it felt like the air left my lungs. I stayed where I was. Before everything fell apart, I was someone who believed in simple things. Love was supposed to be steady. Family was supposed to protect you. I trusted easily because I'd never been given a reason not to. Back then, I thought loyalty was a given, not something you had to earn or defend. I was deeply in love. The kind of love that made the future feel solid, almost guaranteed. My fiancé and I talked about everything. Where we'd live, how many kids we might have, the names we liked but pretended not to care about yet. We planned holidays we hadn't taken and houses we couldn't afford. It wasn't flashy, but it felt real. Safe. I remember lying awake at night, imagining a life that felt warm and predictable in the best way. When we got engaged, I thought it sealed something permanent. I remember staring at the ring more than I should have, not because of its size or sparkle, but because of what it represented. Chosen. Secure. Finally settled. My father had opinions about everything, though I didn't see it clearly then. He framed his control as concern, his interference as guidance. He always knew what was best, and I had spent most of my life learning how to agree without questioning him too much. When he asked about my plans, my finances, my future, I thought it meant he cared. My cousin was always there too. Close enough to feel like a sister. She helped me dress shop, listened to me ramble about wedding colors and venues, teased me about how boringly happy I sounded. There was a competitiveness beneath her smiles, but I brushed it off. That was just her personality, I told myself. She wanted what she didn't have, but she still loved me. At least, I thought she did. Looking back now, that version of me feels painfully innocent. I didn't see the warning signs because I wasn't looking for them. I believed love protected you. I believed family wouldn't cross certain lines. I had no idea how fragile all of it really was. We announced our engagement at a family gathering, the kind my father loved to host. Formal enough to show off, intimate enough to keep control. The house was full of familiar faces, overlapping conversations, the smell of food that took hours to prepare. When my fiancé squeezed my hand and I raised my glass, the room quieted in that expectant way that should have felt thrilling. I smiled as I told them the news, waiting for the rush of excitement I'd imagined. There were gasps, applause, a few happy tears. My brother grinned. Aunts rushed forward to hug me. For a brief moment, everything felt right. Then I looked at my father. His smile came a second too late, stretched tight across his face like something rehearsed. He congratulated us, his voice steady, but his eyes didn't soften. They flicked between me and my fiancé, assessing, calculating. I felt a strange chill settle in my stomach, though I couldn't have explained why. This was what he'd always said he wanted for me: stability, marriage, a respectable future. Yet something about it clearly unsettled him. My cousin stood nearby, glass in hand, watching more than celebrating. When she hugged me, it lingered just a bit too long. Her congratulations sounded sincere, but her eyes drifted back to my fiancé again and again. After that night, she found reasons to talk to him more. Asked questions she'd never asked before. Laughed a little too hard at his jokes. I noticed it, but I told myself I was imagining things. At some point, my father asked my fiancé to step outside with him. It was casual, almost friendly, but the way my father's hand settled on his shoulder made my skin prickle. They were gone longer than necessary. When they returned, my fiancé looked distracted, distant, like something heavy had been placed in his hands. I almost asked what they talked about. The question hovered on my tongue, fueled by a growing sense of unease. Instead, I swallowed it. I trusted my father. I trusted the man I was going to marry. Whatever instinct was whispering that night, I ignored it. I didn't know I'd just watched the moment everything began to unravel. The change didn't happen all at once, which somehow made it worse. At first, it was small things I tried not to overthink. A missed call here. A delayed reply there. He blamed work, stress, exhaustion. I wanted to believe him, so I did. Love, I told myself, wasn't always perfectly balanced. Sometimes one person carried more weight. Then the plans started disappearing. Dinners we'd talked about all week were suddenly postponed. Weekends together turned into vague maybes. When I was with him, he seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere, his affection muted. He smiled less. Touched me less. It felt like reaching for someone who kept stepping just out of range. I asked him what was wrong more times than I want to admit. Each time, he brushed it off. Nothing, he said. You're imagining things. The words landed harder than he realized. Doubt crept in, not about him, but about myself. I wondered if I was becoming needy, paranoid, difficult. I worked harder to be understanding, to be patient, afraid that pressing too hard would push him further away. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I confronted him one evening, my voice shaking despite my effort to sound calm. I told him I felt like I was losing him. I begged him to tell me the truth, whatever it was. He stared past me, jaw clenched, like he'd already decided how this would end. When he finally spoke, the excuses spilled out quickly, rehearsed and empty. He wasn't ready. He needed space. Things had changed. None of it made sense. None of it explained how love could evaporate so suddenly. I searched his face for emotion, for regret, for anything familiar, but he looked relieved more than anything else. Afterward, my cousin was the one who called. She showed up with sympathy and soft words, told me she'd always be there for me. She listened while I cried, nodded while I questioned everything. At the time, her presence felt like a lifeline. I didn't see how closely she followed the details of my pain, how carefully she asked about him. When I was alone again, the humiliation set in. I replayed every conversation, every moment, trying to find where I'd failed. I was heartbroken, confused, and desperate for answers that never came. Love hadn't just ended. It had disappeared, leaving me to stand in the wreckage alone. I didn't learn the truth right away. In fact, years passed before I understood why my life had unraveled so neatly, so completely. By then, the pain had dulled into something quieter, something I carried without thinking about every day. I told myself I didn't need answers anymore. I was wrong. The truth came out by accident, the way devastating things often do. I was visiting home for a short, obligatory stay when I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My father's voice drifted down the hallway, low and irritated, paired with my cousin's sharp whisper. I froze, hidden just enough to listen. At first, the words didn't register. Then a number was mentioned. A payment. A favor that had cost more than it should have. When I confronted him later, he didn't even deny it. He sighed like a man tired of explaining himself, as if I were a child who simply didn't understand how the world worked. He told me he'd done what was necessary. He had paid my fiancé to walk away from me, and to marry my cousin instead. He said it calmly, almost proudly, like it was a strategic move that had saved the family from embarrassment. His reasons spilled out without apology. My cousin was a better fit, he said. More obedient. Easier to manage. The marriage kept money where it belonged, kept appearances intact. He spoke about inheritance, reputation, and stability as if they mattered more than people. Love wasn't part of the equation. It never had been. I remember feeling strangely numb at first, like my body refused to process what my mind already understood. Then the grief came crashing in, sharp and overwhelming. Every memory twisted into something ugly. Every moment of confusion suddenly had an explanation. The man I loved hadn't just left me. He'd been bought. Fury followed grief, hot and uncontrollable. I realized this hadn't been a mistake or a moment of weakness. It had been planned. Calculated. Decided without my knowledge or consent. My father hadn't lost me accidentally. He'd traded me away. That was the moment something inside me broke for good, and something else, harder and colder, took its place. Once the truth settled in, I made the mistake of thinking it would matter to other people. I believed that if they knew what had been done to me, someone would be outraged on my behalf. Someone would admit it was wrong. Instead, the story shifted the moment it left my mouth. I was called dramatic for bringing it up, bitter for not letting it go, unstable for reacting too emotionally to something that had happened years ago. The words followed me through family gatherings, spoken softly but often, like a diagnosis everyone agreed on. My pain became the problem, not what caused it. Meanwhile, my cousin and my ex-fiancé were celebrated as if their relationship had been destiny all along. They were praised for their timing, their compatibility, their maturity. Family members spoke about how well they suited each other, how some things just worked out the way they were meant to. The narrative was polished and convenient. There was no room in it for betrayal. The past was quietly rewritten. I was told the relationship had never been that serious. That I'd misremembered how close we were. That my father had only ever wanted what was best for everyone. Each version erased me a little more, until I began to feel like an inconvenient footnote in my own life. Invitations slowed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when I entered a room. I was no longer included in plans, only informed of them after decisions were made. The isolation was subtle but complete. I learned quickly how invisible a person could become when their truth made others uncomfortable. Eventually, something in me gave up. I stopped explaining. Stopped defending myself. Stopped hoping for understanding from people who had benefited from my silence. I realized I was chasing validation from the very people who had caused the damage. Letting go of that hope hurt more than I expected, but it also freed me. For the first time, I stopped measuring myself by their approval and started listening to a quieter, steadier voice inside me instead. Leaving felt less like a choice and more like survival. I packed what I could fit into my car and drove away from the town that held too many memories and not enough kindness. There was no dramatic goodbye, no speech about starting over. I left quietly, the way people do when they've learned that announcing pain only invites judgment. Starting from nothing is rarely romantic. I took work that didn't match my degree and lived in places that echoed when I spoke out loud. Money was always tight. Some nights, dinner was whatever I could stretch the longest. Loneliness followed me everywhere, especially in the early months, when I'd come home exhausted and realize there was no one to ask how my day had been. The silence was heavy, but it was honest. There were setbacks I didn't tell anyone about. Applications rejected. Opportunities that fell through at the last minute. Days when I questioned whether leaving had been a mistake. But every time I thought about going back, I remembered how small I'd felt there, how carefully I'd had to exist. That memory pushed me forward when motivation failed. Without family support, I learned how capable I was. I learned how to ask for help without shame and how to say no without guilt. I built routines that belonged only to me. Slowly, almost without noticing, I became stronger. Not hardened, stronger. The difference mattered. Career progress didn't happen overnight, but it came. I found work that challenged me, then work that valued me. I earned promotions, not because of connections or favors, but because I showed up and delivered. Each small win repaired something inside me. My confidence stopped being theoretical and became earned. Healing was less visible but just as important. I let myself grieve the life I'd lost instead of pretending it hadn't mattered. I learned that self-worth doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself, even when no one else does. By the time I was finally at peace, I realized something surprising. I no longer needed my family's approval. I didn't need to prove anything to them. The life I'd built wasn't loud or flashy, but it was mine. And it was far better than anything they'd imagined for me. The invitation arrived on an ordinary afternoon, slipped between bills and advertisements like it didn't carry the weight of years. My brother's name was printed neatly on the envelope, formal and familiar. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my chest tightening in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I hadn't expected to hear from them like this. Not now. Not after so much distance. I set it aside at first, telling myself I'd deal with it later. But the question followed me everywhere. Go back or stay away? Reopen old wounds or protect the peace I'd worked so hard to build? Part of me wanted to decline immediately, to keep my life neatly separated from the people who had hurt me. Avoidance had kept me safe for years. Then the messages started. Subtle at first. My presence would mean so much. It was time to move on. Family is family. The words were familiar, heavy with expectation and very little understanding. No one asked how it might feel for me. They never did. For days, I went back and forth. I imagined walking into that room again, seeing faces that had once decided I was expendable. I imagined staying home too, letting the past continue to dictate my choices from a distance. That thought unsettled me more than the fear. I realized then that avoiding them wasn't the same as being strong. It had been necessary once, but I wasn't that person anymore. I didn't need to hide from what had happened to me. I needed to face it on my own terms. So I checked the box that said I would attend. Not because I wanted reconciliation. Not because I expected apologies. I went because I was done running. I went for closure, mine, not theirs. The reception was in full swing when it happened. Plates were cleared, music softened, and conversations loosened with alcohol and comfort. I stood near the edge of a small group, listening more than speaking, when my father joined us. He looked older, but not humbler. His presence still carried that familiar authority, the kind that assumed agreement before words were even spoken. Someone asked me what I'd been doing all these years. Before I could answer, my father chuckled lightly and waved a hand. "Oh, you know," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "She's always been independent. Took a while to find her footing." The smile he gave me was thin, patronizing, practiced. It was the same tone he'd used when explaining away my absence, my silence, my supposed failures. Something in me went still. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile either. I simply corrected him. I talked about my work, my achievements, the life I'd built. I spoke calmly, factually, without embellishment. I watched as expressions shifted, interest replacing indifference, surprise edging out polite boredom. My father's smile faltered, just slightly. Then my cousin laughed, a sharp, nervous sound, and said something about how things worked out the way they were meant to. That was when I looked directly at her. For the first time all night, I didn't soften my gaze. I don't know if I planned to say it. Maybe the moment demanded honesty. Maybe I was just tired of carrying it alone. I mentioned the deal. The money. The arrangement that had quietly reshaped all our lives. The words landed heavier than I expected. Conversations nearby stopped. Someone dropped a glass. My father's face drained of color. My cousin stared at me, frozen between outrage and fear. My ex-fiancé looked like a man watching a version of himself he tried very hard to forget. No one interrupted me. No one laughed it off. The shock moved through the room in slow waves. People looked from one face to another, recalculating everything they thought they knew. My father tried to speak, then stopped. For once, there was nothing he could control. I didn't wait for explanations or apologies. I didn't need them. The truth was out, exposed in real time, undeniable. And for the first time, I wasn't the one standing alone in it. The room didn't erupt the way movies promise it will. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, silence settled in, thick and uncomfortable, stretching longer than anyone knew how to fill. Conversations stalled mid-thought. Laughter died quickly. The celebration stumbled, unsure how to continue now that something ugly had been dragged into the light. My cousin was the first to recover, though not gracefully. She shook her head, lips tight, insisting I was exaggerating, misunderstanding, being emotional again. Her denial sounded rehearsed, fragile, like a story she'd told herself too many times to abandon now. My ex-fiancé couldn't meet anyone's eyes. His shame clung to him, visible in the way his shoulders slumped, the way he suddenly seemed smaller than I remembered. My father, for once, looked panicked. He tried to steer conversations away, to minimize, to regain control, but it slipped through his fingers. Authority only works when people believe in it, and something fundamental had cracked. I watched him realize that not every mistake can be managed, not every truth buried. I didn't argue with them. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I had already lived with the worst of it. There was nothing they could say now that would undo the years I'd spent rebuilding myself from the ground up. I had no interest in watching them scramble to feel better about what they'd done. So I left. I slipped out quietly, past the flowers and the music and the carefully staged happiness. The night air felt cooler, lighter. With every step away from the venue, my chest loosened, as if I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. I sat in my car for a moment before driving off, letting the silence settle in a different way this time. Not heavy. Not lonely. Peaceful. Betrayal shaped the pain I carried for a long time. It influenced who I became, how carefully I learned to trust, how fiercely I protected my sense of self. But it didn't get the final word. Survival did. Growth did. The life I built when no one was watching did. I didn't leave with revenge. I left with something far more valuable. My freedom, intact and undeniable, finally belonging to me alone.